The 9731st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation who asked for the floor.
Господин председатель, прежде чем начнется это заседание, я хочу обратить внимание на ряд принципиально важных для понимания происходящего процедурных моментов. Как известно, изначально в программе работы славянского председательства на сентябрь никаких брифингов высокого уровня по Украине не было. В ней фигурировало лишь одно заседание в ходе недели высокого уровня, предложенное председательством, по, в общем-то, объединительной теме «Лидерство во имя мира». Это мог бы получиться интересный разговор о развитии вопроса о повышении эффективности многостороннего сотрудничества, который мы подняли в ходе своего председательства в Совете безопасности в июле. Мог бы, но, очевидно, уже не получится, так как западные страны не могли удержаться от того, чтобы отравить атмосферу, в очередной раз пытаясь заполнить эфир набившим всем оскомину всему остальному миру украинским сюжетом. Единственное, для чего они созвали это заседание, чтобы предоставить господину Зеленскому еще одну концертную площадку в ООН, на этот раз в зале заседаний Совета безопасности. А на подпевке у него сегодня собралась целая группа членов ЕС и НАТО, которые дисциплинированно выстраиваются в ряд каждый раз, когда им велят прийти в СБ охаивать Россию. Это могло бы быть даже в чем-то забавной иллюстрацией того, насколько эти страны зависимы в своих внешнеполитических установках от старших братьев по натовскому лагерю, если бы не являлось одновременно очередным печальным примером того, как коллективный Запад в угоду своим геополитическим интересам наносит новые и новые удары по авторитету Совета безопасности. Вот и сегодня славянское председательство намерено допустить на заседание целых 11 делегаций по правилам 37 и 39 временных правил процедуры Совета безопасности. При том, что его формат не открытые дебаты, а брифинг, который в соответствии со сложившейся практикой не предполагает такого количества участников из числа не членов Совета безопасности. Какими критериями руководствовалось председательство, собирая эту группу поддержки? Мы понимаем, Украина, Евросоюз, страны, граничащие с Украиной. Но при чем здесь, скажем, Литва, Германия, Дания, Италия? Какое прямое отношение они имеют к происходящему? Для них это просто возможность попасть в ТВ-картинку и поупражняться в антироссийской риторике. Славянскому председательству это прекрасно известно. Оно с самого начала своей вахты в Совете декларировало приверженность повышению эффективности его работы и обещало строго блюсти устоявшуюся в этом органе практику. Однако все эти обещания оказались пустыми, и Словения попросту прогнулась под давлением старших товарищей из Брюсселя и других европейских столиц. Сожалеем, что так произошло. В итоге Совет будет вынужден слушать под копирку написанные в Брюсселе тезисы членов ЕС и НАТО, которые ровным счетом никакой добавленной стоимости в дискуссии не вносят. Хочу сразу предупредить, что мы тратить время на выслушивание этих клонированных выступлений не намерены. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I take note of the issue he has raised. I agree that as a general principle, proportionality in numbers should be observed when the Security Council invites non-Council member states to participate in Council meetings. And as Council President for this month, we have been moderate as to the number of non-Council members invited to participate, including for today's meeting. Nonetheless, I wish to underline that the criterion set out in Rule 37 of the Provisional Rules of Procedure for participation is based not on numbers, but rather that the interests of a state should be specially affected. Each of the non-members to be invited to today's meeting has been invited to participate in various Security Council meetings on Ukraine prior to this one, and has thus already been considered by the Council to meet the criterion of being specially affected. It is our view, therefore, that it is correct procedure for an invitation to participate be extended to each of them again today. And as for the open debate, Leadership for Peace, it remains on the agenda for tomorrow, and all members of the United Nations are invited to participate. I would like to warmly welcome the Secretary General, distinguished presidents, ministers, and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with the Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Denmark, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Turkey, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I know. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite His Excellency Mr. Joseph Borrell Fontelles, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided.
The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item number 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Excellencies, 2 days ago, in the newly agreed Pact for the Future, world leaders reaffirmed their commitment to international law and to the Charter of the United Nations. Our organization is based on the principle of sovereignty of all member states within their internationally recognized borders. The Charter unequivocally stipulates that all states must refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state, and that international disputes must be settled by peaceful means. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, following the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and city of Sevastopol a decade ago, is a clear violation of these principles. And civilian populations continue to pay the price. The death toll keeps rising, nearly 10 million people have fled their homes. Systematic attacks against hospitals, schools, supermarkets are only adding pain and misery. Power cuts and infrastructure damage have left millions in the dark. I strongly condemn all attacks on civilians and civilian facilities wherever they occur and whoever is responsible. They all must stop immediately. And I remain deeply concerned about the safety, humanitarian needs, and basic human rights of people residing in occupied areas. Mr. President, despite immense challenges, the United Nations remains fully engaged as the largest international presence in Ukraine. This year alone, and together with our partners, we have provided life-saving aid to more than 6.2 million people. but we need the support of the international community. 15 million people in Ukraine require humanitarian assistance, more than half of them women and girls. But as winter is approaching, less than half of our 2024 humanitarian response plan is funded. I urge donors to help us pursue our vital work on the ground. We are also assisting the government of Ukraine in its recovery and reconstruction efforts. This includes access to basic services and the restoration of Ukraine's energy production capacities. In recent weeks, we have seen a resurgence of inflammatory rhetoric and incidents around nuclear sites, particularly at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and, alarmingly, at the Kursk nuclear power plant in the Russian Federation. I commend the International Atomic Energy Agency, including its critical presence in Ukraine's nuclear sites, to help ensure nuclear safety and security. And I urge all parties to act responsibly and avoid any declaration or action that could further destabilize an already incendiary situation. Monsieur le Président, 2 ans et demi après l'invasion à grande échelle de l'Ukraine, plus de 11 000 civils ont été tués. Plus cette guerre tragique se prolonge, plus le risque d'escalade et de débordement est grand. Cela n'affecterait pas seulement la région, mais aggraverait les tensions et les divisions mondiales à un moment où notre monde a désespérément besoin de plus de coopération et d'action collective. Nous devons mettre fin aux souffrances et briser le cycle de la violence dans l'intérêt du peuple ukrainien, du peuple russe et du monde entier. L'initiative de la mer Noire et les échanges de prisonniers de guerre nous le rappellent. Lorsqu'il y a une volonté politique, la diplomatie peut réussir, même dans les heures les plus sombres. Bien que la paix puisse aujourd'hui paraître hors de portée, les nombreux appels au dialogue représentent une lueur d'espoir. Intensifions donc nos efforts pour aboutir à la paix en Ukraine. Une paix juste, totale et durable. Une paix conforme à la Charte des Nations Unies, au droit international et aux résolutions de l'Assemblée générale. L'Organisation des Nations Unies soutiendra tout effort en ce sens et je vous remercie.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. And now I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Your Excellencies. One day in this hall, it will surely be said that Russia's war against Ukraine has ended, not frozen, not paused, not forgotten, truly ended. And this will happen not because someone got tired of the war, not because someone traded something with Putin. Russia's war against Ukraine will end because the UN Charter will work. It must work. Our Ukrainian right to self-defense must prevail. Our cooperation with nations of the world who value life as we do, our territorial integrity, our sovereignty, the independence of our country. And we are defending what every nation would surely want to protect for itself and what the UN Charter grants to all. And it is Russia that always has to lie to justify its war, not us. Russia cannot refer to the UN Charter to explain what it is doing against us, against Ukraine, Ukrainian people. In fact, in Russia's perverted way, in its crooked world, it does refer to the Charter, but that's simply insane. Russia stayed silent because it couldn't explain why a Russian missile recently struck a grain ship bound for an Egyptian port through the Black Sea. Russia either stays silent or lies about why its drones and missiles are found in the airspace of Poland, Moldova, Romania. Every day, Ukrainians are wounded and killed. Every day. Today, once again, Russian bombs hit residential buildings. Even an ordinary bread factory became a target. What's so threatening to Russia about making bread? Putin has no answer, and Russia never has an honest answer when asked why its army kills children in Ukraine, defeats schools and hospitals, and fights not for justice, but for a blackout for a neighboring nation. Putin has nothing to say if you ask him why he tries to drag Belarus into the war, why his propagandists threaten nations in the Caucasus or Central Asia, or why Russia invests the most not in human development, but in hatred. Russia has no legitimate reason, none at all, for making Iran and North Korea de facto accomplices in its criminal war in Europe, with their weapons, killing us, killing Ukrainians, and helping Putin steal our land from our people. We know some in the world want to talk to Putin. We know it, to meet, to talk, to speak, but what could they possibly hear from him? That he's upset because we are exercising our right to defend our people, or that he wants to keep the war and terror going just so no one thinks he was wrong. It's insane too. From the very first second of this war, Russia has been doing things that cannot possibly be justified under the UN Charter. Every destroyed Ukrainian city, every burned village, and there are already hundreds and hundreds serves as proof that Russia is committing an international crime. And that's why this war can't simply fade away. That's why this war can't be calmed by talks. Action is needed. And I'm grateful to all the nations that are truly helping in ways that save the lives of our people. Putin has broken so many international norms and rules that he won't stop on his own. Russia can only be forced into peace. And that is exactly what's needed, forcing Russia into peace as the sole aggressor in this war, the sole violator of the UN Charter. Now, as we near the third winter of this war, Russia is once again trying to destroy our energy system, and this fall they are being even more cynical. They are preparing to target our nuclear power plants, 3 of them. We have this information, and we have proof of this. If Russia is ready to go that far, it means nothing you value matters to Moscow. This kind of Russian cynicism will keep striking if it's given any room in the world. The UN Charter leaves no room for that, and that's why the peace formula leaves no room either. In 2022, in the midst of the war, when I proposed the peace formula, I was proposing to uphold the UN Charter, to make effective everything that this institution was created for. Every point of the peace formula is rooted in the principles and purposes and norms of the UN Charter, in the rights it grants nations, and in the resolutions of the General Assembly that have already been supported by the majority of the nations. And we do not have different versions of the UN Charter for different parts of the world. We do not have regional quasi-charters. There is no separate UN Charter for BRICS or for the G7. There is no separate Russian-Iranian UN Charter or no separate Chinese-Brazilian UN Charter. There is one UN Charter which unites everyone, must unite everyone. The path to a just peace is the same. Clear steps that everyone understands equally, and this is reflected in the peace formula. It is the fulfillment of the UN Charter. And we all know what needs to be done if we honestly look at the situation and truly want to stop Russia's war, and most importantly, act together, of course in unity. without creating new and unnecessary divisions of the world into blocs or regional groups. Unity always works for peace. And we have to prepare the second peace summit to end the war altogether. And I invite all of you, all principled nations, to join us in this process, all who truly respect the UN Charter. We invite China, we invite Brazil, I have already invited India. We are working with African nations, with all of Latin America, Middle East, Central Asia, Europe, the Pacific region, North America, all. All are equally important for peace, all, without exceptions, just as the UN Charter must work without exceptions. This is the process that will lead us to peace, to a just peace, a real peace, a peace that will last. All of us already know how to achieve it. We have the peace formula, we have the UN Charter, and we have all the strengths needed to make it happen. What's needed is determination. Thank you so much. Slava Ukraini.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Zelensky, for his statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Prime Minister of Slovenia. I wish to thank the Secretary General for his insightful thoughts. I welcome the participation of President Zelensky at this meeting, and I also appreciate the participation of other countries at this discussion. Excellencies, the European countries are united in condemnation of this aggression, which violates every possible principle and law, including UN Charter. My colleagues will elaborate more on this. I'm genuinely frustrated that I sit here in front of you at this Council, together with the most powerful countries of the world, with the sole responsibility to ensure peace and security across the globe, and yet we are unable to do anything about the most extensive conventional war the world has seen in decades, that we are powerless in bringing peace to the citizens in Ukraine. It is a good opportunity to accept some sobering truths and acknowledge that this Council has failed the people of Ukraine. But please, allow me to shed a slightly different light on the Ukrainian case. Even in this dire situation, while Ukrainian civilian casualties are on the rise, while critical civilian infrastructure is collapsing, and while battlefields keep expanding, Ukraine has not failed the international community. Far from it. Even in the darkest moments of this ongoing aggression, Ukraine remained an active member of the United Nations who stood in solidarity with other countries. I can personally attest to this. 1 year ago, Slovenia experienced unprecedented floods of catastrophic dimensions. Rivers were overflowing, family houses were buried underneath heaps of earth, and people were drowning. It was a catastrophe of proportions never seen before in my country. And during all of this, Ukraine displayed a gesture Slovenians will never forget. During the war, while missiles and drones were hitting Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, Ukraine sent a whole convoy of aid and over 50 members of its national emergency team to help deal with the aftermath of the floods in our country. Usually we would all say that we stand with Ukraine, but when it really mattered to us Slovenians, it was Ukraine who stood with Slovenia. While Ukrainian ports and ships are under constant barrage, and while the Ukrainian civilian population is suffering, Ukraine has done its utmost to practice solidarity with the rest of the world. With its Grain from Ukraine initiative, it has ensured the flow of tens of thousands of tons of grain to those who need it most. Even in the midst of existential war, Ukraine stands with the international community and member states when they need it. For Slovenia, the case is clear. With this war, a lot is at stake. If Russia wins this war, then trampling of international humanitarian law and gross violations of the Charter will win as well. If Putin prevails, not only Europe, but the whole of the world will become less safe and less stable. The United Nations were created to prevent bigger countries from imposing their will on their neighbors. We should not allow its members to violate rules and the UN Charter with impunity just because they believe they can. If unchallenged, each of us will pay the price. This is not a world Slovenia wants to be part of. We will do everything in our power to prevent this from becoming a new normal and preserve the integrity of the Charter and international law, not just in Ukraine, but also in Palestine and the rest of the Middle East. Dear colleagues, the process of restoring European security and healing the rifts in the international relationship can begin only when peace in Ukraine is achieved. Until then, we will keep pressing for peace. Only a just peace will give generations of Ukrainians a brighter future, and only a lasting peace will allow them to grow and flourish. Such peace cannot come at the expense of fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter, including the respect for territorial integrity. This vision is worth believing in and acting towards it. Slovenia will continue to stand by Ukraine until they achieve this vision of just peace. And I know Ukraine will stand with us if and when we need it. I shall now I resume my function as the President of the Council, and now I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ian Borg, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign and European Affairs and Trade of the Republic of Malta.
Mr. President, I begin by thanking the Slovenian Presidency for convening today's meeting and the Secretary General for his important briefing and sobering remarks. I also welcome the participation of President Zelensky. Malta remains gravely concerned about the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. We are also deeply worried about the negative repercussions that this war is having and will continue to have on the multilateral system. By invading its sovereign neighbor in violation of international law, Russia also launched a direct affront to the UN Charter. The international community cannot and must not look the other way. This war, which has now been going on for 2.5 years, is having devastating consequences on the region and beyond. Ukraine, just like every other country, has the right to live in peace and security within its internationally recognized borders. It has been denied this right for far too long. This is why we have joined others in calling for this meeting. Mr. President, over the past 2 months, we have witnessed an intensification of attacks in Ukraine. Missiles and drones have impacted civilians and continue to increase the death toll. They have also targeted critical infrastructure in Ukraine, in particular energy infrastructure. Coordinated attacks on Ukraine's electric power system have damaged or destroyed numerous power generation and distribution facilities. The effects on the civilian population will last for years and will require significant resources. The impact that explosive remnants of war will have on future generations also merit our full attention. In the shorter term, the people of Ukraine will have to contend with an electricity deficit and limited heating during the harsh winter months. Such attacks unnecessarily endanger lives in the upcoming cold winter months. The Security Council cannot let violations of international humanitarian law go unchecked. Critical infrastructure must never be a target. Hospitals must never be a target. Schools must never be a target. And most of all, civilians and children must never be a target. We must continue our efforts to make sure that all perpetrators of such crimes are held accountable. Mr. President, it's imperative that we ensure the nuclear safety of Ukraine's nuclear power plants and to uphold IAEA's 7 pillars for nuclear safety. On numerous occasions, Malta has called on all parties to respect international humanitarian law and uphold the fundamental principles of distinction and proportionality. These are non-negotiable. This war is also having a disproportionate impact on women and children. It has created the largest displacement crisis in decades, with more than 4 million people internally displaced and 6 million living as refugees abroad. Malta strongly reiterates the need to provide humanitarian access to all aid workers operating in Ukraine, and to allow the UN and the related agencies to carry out their duties unhindered. According to OCHA, 14.6 million Ukrainians are in need of humanitarian aid. We must make sure that their needs are met. Malta is also deeply concerned with the possible escalation of this conflict due to the transfer of weapons and related materials to the Russian Federation from DPRK and Iran. This Council needs to ensure that all weapon transfers are done in accordance with international law and in line with the Security Council resolutions. Furthermore, there are also disarmament treaties which ban whole categories of weapons that should not be used in the battlefield. Mr. President, at the end of October last year, in Malta, we hosted talks on Ukraine's 10-point plan for peace, with the participation of more than 65 countries and international organizations. Malta remains committed to assisting Ukraine so as to achieve a comprehensive framework that will lead to a just as well as lasting peace for the people in Ukraine. On this occasion, we again call on the Russian Federation to cease all hostilities and withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The international community requires a lasting solution to this conflict, a peace which respects borders, human rights, and the UN Charter. Until that day comes, Ukraine has the right to defend itself from this aggression in line with Article 51 of the Charter. I thank you.
Thank His Excellency Mr. Borg for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Wang Yi, member of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee and Minister for Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China.
主席先生、秘书长先生、各位同事，我感谢格罗布总理主持今天的会议，感谢古特雷斯秘书长所做的通报，也注意到泽连斯基总统表达的立场。乌克兰危机已进入第3个年头，冲突战事不断蔓延，平民伤亡不断增加，外溢效应不断的加剧。但和平曙光仍然遥远，危机每延宕一天，都会给人民带来更多的苦难，给地区造成更多的破坏，给世界带来更多的动荡不安。这一局面不可持续，必须尽力加以扭转。各方都应以和平为重，以人民为重，真正致力于劝和促谈。为此，中方的主张是：第一，要增强降温局势的危机感。当务之急是遵守战场不外溢、战事不升级、各方不拱火3原则。尤其不应使用大规模杀伤性武器，不应攻击核电站等和平核设施，不应袭击平民和民用设施。向战场输送的武器越多，停火的目标就越难实现，这是需要面对的客观现实。各方应该摒弃冷战对抗思维，为局势降温发挥建设性作用，为早日停火止战创造必要条件。第二，要增强劝和促谈的责任感。对话谈判是解决乌克兰危机的唯一可行出路。如果和谈迟迟无法开启，误解、误判就会积累增加，进而酿成更大的危机。近期，国际上劝和促谈的呼声在进一步的增多，越来越多的南方国家也在为此 自发联合起来，支持和平，积极为和平解决危机营造气氛、积累条件。国际社会要把握当前的契机，形成劝和促谈的合力。第三，要增强管控外溢的紧迫感。乌克兰危机持续外溢，令全球经济雪上加霜，广大全球南方国家遭受严重负面影响，实现联合国2030年可持续发展议程更加困难。任何一方都不能以危机为由，滥施非法单边制裁，无端打压正常经贸往来，更不能借机割裂世界，制造封闭排他的各种集团。中方呼吁国际社会就能源、金融、贸易、粮食安全以及保护油气管道等关键基础设施加强合作，共同维护全球产业链、供应链的稳定畅通，维护发展中国家正当权益和发展空间。安理会承担着维护国际和平与安全的首要职责。在乌克兰问题上，安理会要做分歧矛盾的弥合者，求同存异的倡导者，共同安全的维护者，持久和平的建设者。希望安理会成员着眼大局和长远，多做有利于和解和平的事情，而不是相反。主席先生，中国在乌克兰问题上的立场一以贯之，清晰明确。中国国家主席习近平郑重指出，各国的主权和领土完整应该得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则应该得到遵守，各国的合理安全关切应该得到重视，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力应该得到支持。这是中方在乌克兰问题上的权威立场和根本遵循。中国不是乌克兰危机的制造者，也不是当事方，中国始终站在和平一边。我们同包括俄罗斯、乌克兰在内的各方保持着接触，坚持不懈劝和促谈，积极开展穿梭外交。中方的努力得到国际社会的广泛认可和支持。中方还发布了关于政治解决乌克兰危机的中方立场。之后，我们同巴西联合发布了6点共识，为凝聚各方的共识，推动政治解决乌克兰危机，发挥了应有的作用。我还要明确指出的是，任何在乌克兰问题上向中国推卸责任、攻击抹黑的做法，都是不负责任的，也是不会得逞的。主席先生，我们身处的世界变乱交织，人类面临的风险前所未有。推动政治解决乌克兰危机，建设一个更加安全的世界，这是国际社会的共同愿望，也是世界各国的共同责任。中方呼吁国际社会携起手来，践行共同、综合、合作、可持续的安全观，为早日停火止战凝聚更多的国际共识，为推动政治解决发出更多的理性声音，为实现地区长治久安做出更多的共同努力。谢谢大家。
Thank His Excellency Mr. Yi for his statement, and now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President, and welcome, President Zelensky. We meet more than 2.5 years since Russia launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, shredding the core principles of the United Nations Charter: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. Every day since, Russia has waged a war of aggression, the textbook example of a threat to international peace and security that this Council was created to prevent and address. The question before us today is not what will Russia do? We already know that. Putin will continue to wage his unjust war. The question before us is how we, members of this Council, can end Putin's war and reinforce the international rules and rights that make all of our nations safer and more secure. There are two immediate and interrelated steps that we must take. First, we must address Russia's growing cooperation with North Korea and Iran. Iran has been providing armed drones to the Kremlin since 2022. It built a drone factory in Russia. Just a few weeks ago, it transferred hundreds of short-range ballistic missiles to Russia. And Tehran has trained Russian military personnel in Iran how to operate these weapons. Meanwhile, the DPRK has delivered trainloads of weapons and ammunition to Russia, including ballistic missiles, launchers, and millions of artillery rounds. Support from Tehran and Pyongyang is helping Putin inflict carnage, suffering, and ruin on innocent Ukrainian men, women, and children, demolish Ukrainian apartment buildings, grain silos, and ports, ravage Ukrainian power plants, heating, and natural gas facilities, just as freezing temperatures are setting in. These actions by Iran, North Korea, and Russia have violated multiple Security Council resolutions, resolutions that Russia voted for and, as a permanent member, has a special responsibility to enforce. This is also not a one-way street. The more Russia relies on their support, the more Iran and North Korea extract in return. And the more Putin gives to Pyongyang and Tehran, the more he exacerbates threats to peace and security, not just in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, all around the globe. As North Korea ramps up its military support for Russia, Putin has reciprocated with military commitments and with money. The two countries recently revived a treaty pledging to provide military assistance if either is invaded. In March, Russia used its veto to end the work of the UN panel of experts on the DPRK, which for 14 years had monitored the regime's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Russia's banks are helping North Korea evade sanctions, freeing up more funds for its unlawful weapons programs. All this for a regime that has carried out more than 150 ballistic missile tests since 2022, and whose leader routinely threatens to obliterate South Korea and Japan and other countries. Meanwhile, as Tehran provides Putin with drones, ballistic missiles, and training, Russia is sharing technology with Iran on nuclear issues, as well as space information. The two countries have accelerated negotiations on a comprehensive strategic partnership. Last year, Russia announced plans to send Iran advanced fighter aircraft and attack helicopters. This, as Iran continues to arm, to train, and to fund proxies in the Middle East to carry out terrorist attacks across the region and beyond, including Hamas, whose appalling October 7th attacks killed civilians from over a dozen UN member states, and including the Houthis, whose attacks on international shipping have driven up the cost of food, of medicine, other supplies for people around the world, and have added to the suffering of the Yemeni people. North Korea and Iran are not the only ones aiding and abetting Russia. China, another permanent member of this Council, is the top provider of machine tools, microelectronics, and other items that Russia is using to rebuild, to restock, to ramp up its war machine and sustain its brutal aggression. Now, some may ask how the United States or any other country helping Ukraine defend itself can criticize countries for providing military support to Russia. There is a profound difference. Russia is the aggressor, Ukraine the victim. Russia fights for conquest, Ukraine fights for survival. If countries stop supporting Russia, Putin's invasion would soon come to an end. If countries stop supporting Ukraine, Ukraine could soon come to an end. This brings me to the second step that members of this Council can take. One of the Council's primary responsibilities is seeking to peacefully resolve conflicts. As President Zelensky has said, no one wants peace more than Ukraine. The United States also wants to end this conflict. And before Putin launched his full invasion, we used every tool we could to try to prevent it, including right here at the Security Council. But the way the Council seeks to end this conflict matters. The UN Charter is crystal clear on this point. When fulfilling its responsibilities, the Security Council, and I quote, shall act in accordance with the purpose and principles of the United Nations, end quote. In other words, we must seek a peace that upholds rather than undermines the UN's core tenets. That's why all of us here have a responsibility to support Ukraine's call for a just and lasting peace to end Russia's war of aggression. A just and lasting peace must affirm the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. A just and lasting peace must preserve Ukraine's right to choose its own path, its own allies, its own future. A just and lasting peace requires Ukraine's full participation and assent. A just and lasting peace must support Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery, with Russia paying to fix the damage it's caused. A just and lasting peace must address both accountability and reconciliation. The United States is ready and willing to work with any party dedicated to supporting peace based on these principles. Ukraine has said multiple times that diplomacy is the only way to end this war, and that it's prepared to engage in negotiations. Putin, on the other hand, has no interest in such a peace, recently declaring that Russia would return to the negotiating table only when Ukraine withdraws its troops from Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia. In other words, when Ukraine withdraws from its own territory. Putin continues to claim falsely that Ukraine is not a real state. He continues to deny that the Ukrainian people have their own identity. In Putin's eyes, the Ukrainian people, like Ukraine itself, do not exist. Other countries have put forward their own proposals, some of which make no mention of the UN Charter or its principles, fail to distinguish between the aggressor and the aggressed, and call on all sides to de-escalate. A proposal along these lines would reward Putin's aggression, allow him to rest, rearm, re-invade Ukraine, as he has done time and again. It would also embolden would-be aggressors everywhere around the world. As history teaches us, peace without principle is prologue to more conflict, to more suffering, to more instability. So, to all nations who want this conflict to end, and do it in a way that will endure, the quickest way forward is simple. Stop those who are enabling and fueling Putin's aggression, and demand a just peace that upholds the principles of the United Nations Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Blinken for his statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jean-Noël Barrot, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, Mesdames et Messieurs, cela fait 2 ans et demi que l'Ukraine, avec un courage qui force notre admiration et nous oblige, exerce son droit à la légitime défense. Un droit que lui reconnaît sans ambiguïté notre charte, celui de défendre sa liberté, son territoire, son indépendance, son existence. Je salue à mon tour la présence du président Zelensky parmi nous aujourd'hui, qui incarne ce combat mené par les Ukrainiennes et les Ukrainiens. Ce combat, c'est aussi le nôtre. Comment ne pas s'indigner face à la guerre d'agression brutale, illégale, injustifiable que mène la Russie contre l'Ukraine, devant cette violation massive et continue des principes les plus fondamentaux de la Charte des Nations Unies, devant cette obstination et cette surdité de la Russie alors que nous avons été plus de 140 États à la réprouver et condamner dans des votes sans appel à l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies. Comment ne pas s'indigner face au pilonnage systématique et délibéré d'objectifs civils, devant cette destruction froide et méthodique des infrastructures énergétiques qui plongent les Ukrainiens dans le noir et dans le froid? Comment ne pas s'indigner en constatant ces exactions et ses violations répétées des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire. Comment ne pas condamner le viol utilisé comme arme de guerre? Rien n'est épargné aux Ukrainiennes et aux Ukrainiens. Il faut que cela cesse, il faut que les souffrances cessent. Comment ne pas s'indigner face au destin tragique des enfants de l'Ukraine, à ces jeunes patients en cancérologie à proximité des décombres de l'hôpital pédiatrique de Kiev, aux jeunes Ukrainiennes et Ukrainiens dont la santé mentale vacille, aux orphelines et aux orphelins, à ces enfants et bébés morts dans les frappes russes, à ces milliers et peut-être dizaines de milliers d'enfants arrachés à leurs familles et soumis à une rééducation en Russie ou en Biélorussie, traitement d'une indicible cruauté. Que sont-ils devenus? Que vont-ils devenir? La France continuera de se tenir aux côtés de celles et ceux qui se battent pour le retour des enfants ukrainiens et de soutenir les initiatives en cours. Il ne peut y avoir d'impunité pour ces crimes commis. La Cour pénale internationale a déjà émis 6 mandats d'arrêt contre des responsables russes et la Russie devra rendre des comptes. Personne ne doit se rendre complice de ces crimes qui choquent l'humanité. Qu'on ne dise pas que soutenir l'Ukraine et soutenir la Russie sont 2 choses équivalentes. La Russie viole toutes les règles et attaque son voisin démocratique et pacifique, quand l'Ukraine exerce un droit à se défendre que le droit comme la morale lui reconnaissent. Personne ne devrait soutenir la Russie. Et la France exhorte donc l'ensemble des États à s'abstenir de fournir à la Russie des armes, des biens à double usage, ainsi que des composants qui viendraient alimenter sa guerre d'agression, au premier rang desquels la Corée du Nord et l'Iran. Nous condamnons avec la plus grande fermeté le transfert par l'Iran de missiles balistiques à la Russie, récemment confirmé. Il constitue une escalade importante et une menace directe pour la sécurité européenne. Notre préoccupation est d'autant plus forte que la Russie continue ses manœuvres agressives et dangereuses sur le continent européen de manière de plus en plus désinhibée. L'intégrité territoriale de plusieurs pays européens a été violée de manière répétée cette année et la Russie poursuit son travail de déstabilisation des démocraties, telles la Moldavie ou l'Arménie, 2 États démocratiques dont le seul tort pour Moscou est d'avoir choisi la liberté. Mais, mesdames et messieurs, la guerre d'agression russe est l'affaire de tous, au-delà du continent européen où elle se déroule. C'est l'affaire du monde entier. C'est une guerre contre la sécurité alimentaire et énergétique. Tant d'États et de populations sont affectés par ses conséquences, et ce n'est pas la Russie aujourd'hui, mais la France et ses partenaires qui permettent l'envoi de céréales ukrainiennes à la population civile de Gaza. La guerre d'agression russe est aussi une guerre contre l'ordre international. Accepter le fait accompli russe, ce serait accepter la consécration de la loi du plus fort. Ce serait laisser la porte ouverte à d'autres modifications de frontières par la force. Ce serait renoncer aux principes fondamentaux de la Charte des Nations Unies, dont la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale. Ce serait renoncer à la possibilité même de concevoir une sécurité collective. Il n'y a pas de sécurité collective sans les Nations Unies. Il n'y a pas de Nations Unies sans le respect de la Charte qui lui sert de fondement. C'est notre raison d'être, ici, aux Nations Unies, qui est attaquée. Pour toutes ces raisons, le calcul reposant sur notre lassitude et notre démobilisation est et restera un mauvais calcul. La France continuera à soutenir l'Ukraine sur tous les plans et dans le long terme. Nous activerons tous les instruments européens et garantirons à l'Ukraine un chemin vers l'Union européenne et vers l'OTAN. Un autre chemin que celui de l'agression et celui de la dévastation est possible. Celui d'une paix juste qui devra se faire sur la seule base du droit international dans le respect de son intégrité territoriale. Elle ne peut prendre la forme d'une capitulation de l'agressé, car il y a bien un agresseur et un agressé. La France continuera en ce sens d'apporter son soutien au plan de paix du président Zelensky. L'Ukraine doit être libre de choisir ses alliances et son chemin. Monsieur le Président, si la Russie fait ainsi le choix de cesser d'être une source d'insécurité et d'instabilité, un autre avenir peut se décider. Je vous remercie.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Barrot, for his statement, and now I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Cho Tu-yul, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, I wish to thank you, Dr. Robert Golob, Prime Minister of the Republic of Slovenia, for convening this meeting. I also extend my appreciation to Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his insightful briefing, and I also welcome President Zelensky to this important meeting. 2.5 years have passed since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a conflict that continues to this day to challenge the values and norms that underpin our collective global security. The Republic of Korea remains steadfast in supporting the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Despite repeated calls from the Security Council members for an immediate end to the war, Russia continues its brutal attacks, claiming tens of thousands of civilian lives and destroying the livelihood of millions of innocent citizens. Even more worrying is the recent escalation along the battlefronts, which has led to a significant increase in civilian casualties and the destruction of critical infrastructure. Our hearts are heavy as we witnessed the humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Ukraine. As a nation all too familiar with the anguish of conflict, the Republic of Korea profoundly emphasizes with the struggles endured by the Ukrainian people. This shared understanding strengthens our resolve to end this war and restore peace in Ukraine. The Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative, launched by President Yoon Suk-yeol on the occasion of his visit to Kiev in July 2023, is a powerful testament to our solidarity with Ukraine. Under this initiative, the Republic of Korea committed $200 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine this year. Starting from next year, we will provide $2 billion to be spread out for 5 years to support Ukrainians' reconstruction. We are also collaborating with international partners through the Ukraine donor platform in support of reconstruction efforts in Ukraine. Mr. President, we express grave concern over the military cooperation between the Russian Federation and North Korea. The number and targeted areas of Russia's attacks using North Korean ballistic missiles are increasing in both frequency and intensity, which results in endangering civilians and promoting this brutal war. This constitutes an unequivocal violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. The deepening military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, which was highlighted by the signing of the so-called Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty, not only threatens the peace and security on the Korean Peninsula, but also of Europe. It is deplorable that Russia, a permanent Security Council member and one of the founding states for the non-proliferation regime, violates Security Council resolutions and engage in illegal arms trade with North Korea. Any cooperation that directly or indirectly aids North Korea's military capability is a blatant violation of the relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions and undermines non-proliferation regime. We strongly urge North Korea to comply with the relevant Security Council resolutions and to respond to our proposals to engage in dialogue. Mr. President, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has aggravated geopolitical tensions worldwide, presenting us with challenges of unprecedented scale. In order to fulfill its fundamental duty of maintaining international peace and security, the Security Council must devise effective strategies to navigate the complexities and overcome its inherent constraints. As a non-permanent member of the Security Council, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its unwavering support for and active participation in the Council's work to this end with a renewed sense of urgency. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Cho, for his statement, and I will now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, chers collègues, Mesdames et Messieurs. Il est crucial que ce Conseil continue de réfléchir aux moyens de rétablir la paix et de mettre fin à la guerre russe contre l'Ukraine, et ceci en présence de l'Ukraine. Je salue également la présence du président Zelensky. Je crois fermement à l'importance du respect de la Charte des Nations Unies, du droit international humanitaire, ainsi qu'en l'application des conventions de Genève, dont nous célébrons les 75 ans cette année. Et pourtant, malgré tous les outils établis après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, nous n'avons pas réussi à faire taire les armes. Nous n'avons pas pu empêcher qu'un nombre incalculable de civils en subissent les conséquences. Mesdames et messieurs, jusqu'à présent, ce Conseil n'a pas assumé sa responsabilité. Après 1000 jours de guerre, nous n'avons toujours pas trouvé de solution diplomatique. Pourquoi sommes-nous incapables de nous accorder sur la voie à suivre pour rétablir la paix? Avons-nous perdu la grammaire commune de la paix? Si j'occupe ma fonction de ministre, c'est parce que je crois en la force de la politique au service du bien commun. La politique doit toujours remettre en question la maxime du stratège von Clausewitz, selon laquelle la guerre est la simple continuation de la politique par d'autres moyens. Et l'ONU est la politique. Excellence, faire la paix demande du courage. En organisant le premier sommet pour la paix en Ukraine en juin dernier, la Suisse a eu l'audace de placer la paix à l'agenda international, et ceci en pleine guerre. Des pays issus des 5 continents se sont réunis près de Lucerne pour débattre de simplement trois thèmes essentiels à la construction de la paix. 1. La sécurité nucléaire. 2. La sécurité alimentaire. Et 3. La dimension humanitaire du conflit. Le communiqué conjoint du Bürgerstock signé par une majorité de participants représentant le monde entier a permis d'atténuer certains blocages révélés par la guerre en Ukraine et de restaurer un début de confiance entre nous. Ce premier pas vers la paix ne doit pas rester sans suite. Il est désormais essentiel de poursuivre ce dialogue également avec la Russie. Seule une diplomatie pragmatique pourra nous sortir de cette impasse qui a déjà coûté trop de vies. Mesdames et messieurs, si la paix doit être notre priorité, la reconstruction de l'Ukraine est également une responsabilité collective. Une paix durable dépendra également d'une reconstruction bien préparée. Dès le début du conflit, la Suisse a posé les bases de cette reconstruction avec la conférence de Lugano. L'une de nos priorités est le déminage humanitaire. Nous investissons actuellement 120 millions de dollars pour déminer les zones civiles et agricoles en Ukraine. La conférence Ukraine Mine Action Conference, organisée par la Suisse et l'Ukraine dans quelques semaines, le 17 et le 18 octobre prochain en Suisse, discutera des besoins et des solutions pour cette action. L'Ukraine s'apprête à affronter son 3e hiver en temps de guerre. Il est de notre devoir d'offrir enfin au peuple ukrainien un printemps de paix. Je vous remercie.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Cassis for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Hugh Hilton Todd, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Please accept my commendations for Slovenia's efficient handling of the Council's business this month. I also thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his sobering briefing on the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I also welcome President Zelensky to this meeting. Mr. President, next month will mark 79 years since the entry into force of the United Nations Charter. A charter that binds, and I quote, "We the peoples of the United Nations," end of quote, to the collective pursuit of peace, the promotion of human rights, and the advancement of social and economic progress. In choosing to join the United Nations and accepting the obligations of its charter, we each agreed to be bound by all of its provisions, including the prohibition on the use of force, enshrined in Article 2.4. This prohibition is one of the Charter's most explicit provisions and the foremost fundamental principle of international law. It demands that every member state of this organization refrain in its international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. 79 years later, we find ourselves confronted with conflicts and crises that challenge the most basic tenets of the Charter and the realization of our collective desire for peace. Most notable is the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which has already claimed the lives of over 11,000 civilians. Ghana deplores the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state and joins the international community in calling for full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We reiterate that the principles of the respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, the prohibition on the use of threat or use of force, and the peaceful resolution of all disputes must be adhered to by all member states of the United Nations. The war in Ukraine continues to cause widespread suffering and destruction and is characterized by an almost wanton disregard for international law, including international humanitarian law. It has also had a detrimental impact on nuclear safety, energy security, the environment, and global food security. In both Ukraine and Russia, civilians continue to bear the brunt of the conflict, with many having paid the ultimate price. The resulting humanitarian situation has reached crisis level, with 40% of Ukraine's population now in desperate need for humanitarian assistance and over 10 million displaced. Any further escalation of the conflict will no doubt have even more dire consequences for both countries, the wider region, and the world. Ghana reiterates its call for the parties to the conflict to comply fully with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We also call on the Russian Federation to allow full, unhindered humanitarian access to the people in need in the temporarily occupied territories. Mr. President, in seeking a path to lasting peace, Ghana would like to underscore the following 3 points. First, we wish to emphasize that this conflict cannot be solved through military means. Only a serious political and diplomatic process can pave the path to peace. Ghana commends the efforts of those who have committed to finding pathways to peacefully ending the war and stresses the need for this to be a collective endeavor. We therefore encourage further intensification of diplomatic dialogue with the conflict parties toward the de-escalation of hostilities and in the pursuit of sustainable peace. Second, respect for the provisions of the UN Charter and international law must be upheld. The acquisition of territory by force must not be condoned in any way, either individually or collectively. Every state must be able to pursue its national development without an unnecessary and expensive burden of having to arm itself in defense and its sovereignty and territorial integrity. My third and final point is that for the bells of peace to ring, the drums of war must be silenced. In this respect, Ghana reiterates its call for the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and end its invasion of Ukraine. This can be the first step towards finding a lasting and sustainable peace. President, Excellencies, as we prepare to mark the 79th anniversary of the entry into force of the United Nations Charter on the 24th of October, let us use the opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to its purposes, principles, and to international law. Let us also reaffirm the primacy of international cooperation and diplomacy in preventing conflicts and settling disputes. We, the peoples, deserve no less. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Todd, for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ahmed Attaf, Minister of Foreign Affairs and National Community abroad of Algeria.
أشكركم السيد الرئيس وأهنئكم على تولي بلدكم الصديق رئاسة مجلس الأمن وعلى إدارتكم الحكيمة والمحكمة لأشغالنا. نلتئم اليوم والحرب المستعرة في أوكرانيا تشارف عامها الثالث دون أن تلوح في الأفق معالم الحل المنشود ودون أن يسجل أدنى تقدم ملموس على درب تهدئة الأوضاع والتخفيف من وطأتها واحتواء انعكاساتها وتداعياتها. وما يزيد من حدة أسفنا أن شح المبادرات الدولية الجامعة وعقم التحركات الدبلوماسية الهادفة لتغليب لغة الحوار وإحلال السلام صارت اليوم صفة لصيقة بكل ما يطال هذا النزاع من تعقيدات وتفاقمات، في حين أن منطق الأمور يؤكد يوما بعد يوم أن تداعيات ومخلفات هذا النزاع لها من الخطورة والجسامة ما يحتم عدم الاستكانة لمنطق الأمر الواقع وعدم الخضوع والاستسلام للعراقيل أيا كانت طبيعتها أو للعوائق أيا كانت مشقتها. إننا نعتقد تمام الاعتقاد أن الموضوع المطروح أمامنا اليوم لا يصح البتة وصفه بالصراع محدود النطاق أو المفعول أو الانعكاس، فهذه الحرب قد كبدت الطرفين الروسي والأوكراني خسائر فادحة في الأرواح والممتلكات والمقدرات، وفتحت الأبواب واسعة أمام مأساة إنسانية مكتملة الأركان. وهذه الحرب قد أدخلت القارة الأوروبية بأكملها في أخطر أزمة مفتوحة على كافة الاحتمالات والتعقيدات منذ الحرب العالمية الثانية. وهذه الحرب قد طالت بأصدائها وتداعياتها السياسية والاقتصادية والأمنية جميع بقاع المعمورة التي تأثرت ولا تزال تتأثر بها، في ظل ما خلفته من أخطر أزمة في منظومة الأمن الجماعي، وفي ظل ما صار يلازمها من استقطابات وتجاذبات في العلاقات الدولية. إن هذه الاعتبارات قد شكلت في مجملها بواعث المبادرة التي تقدم بها رئيس الجمهورية السيد عبد المجيد تبون للوساطة بين طرفي النزاع روسيا وأوكرانيا. ومبلغ مقصدنا في ذلك كان ولا يزال البناء على ما يجمع الجزائر بهذين البلدين الصديقين من علاقات متميزة ومتجذرة في أرضية صلبة من الثقة والتفاهم والتعاون، وتوظيف هذه العلاقات في سبيل تقريب وجهات النظر والعمل على تجاوز الصراع بالطرق السلمية. ولذات المقصد انخرطت بلادي بشكل جدي في المساعي الحميدة التي باشرت بها مجموعة الاتصال العربية غداة نشوب الصراع. فقناعتنا تبقى راسخة من أننا أمام حرب لا رابح فيها والكل فيها خاسر، ما دام هناك أرواح تزهق وشعوب تهجر وبنى تحتية تدمر واقتصادات تقوض وأمن إقليمي ودولي يتعرض للتهديد المباشر والمضر للجميع على أكثر من صعيد. وبذات القدر نظل مقتنعين تمام الاقتناع من أن إنهاء هذا الحرب وإطفاء فتيلها لا يزال في مقدور واستطاعة المجموعة الدولية، إذا ما تم توفير الشروط اللازمة والمناخ المناسب لنجاح أي مبادرة دبلوماسية تسعى لتحقيق تسوية تنال قبول طرفي النزاع والتزامهما بتجسيدها. ومن هذا المنظور فإن الجزائر تدعو إلى تكثيف الجهود ومضاعفتها من أجل إطلاق مسار تفاوضي شامل وبناء، مسار يهدف لتحقيق حل سياسي وسلمي للصراع، لأن الحل لا يمكن أن يكون إلا سياسيا وسلميا، ومسار ينأى بطرفي النزاع عن منطق الغالب والمغلوب، لأنه لا غالب ولا مغلوب في حرب بين بلدين جارين لهما تاريخ مشترك طويل من تشابك المصالح والروابط، ومسار يرتكز على المبادئ المكرسة في ميثاق الأمم المتحدة وعلى شرعية القانون الدولي، لأن هذه المبادئ وهذه الشرعية هي الحكم الفصل بين الدول الأعضاء في منظمتنا الأممية. وأخيرا وليس آخرا، مسار يضع نصب أولوياته معالجة الأسباب الجذرية للصراع برمته وإحاطة الشواغل الأمنية للطرفين بالعناية اللازمة، لأن هذا النهج يظل وحده الكفيل بتوفير مقومات استدامة وثبات الحل المنشود والمطلوب والمتطلع إليه عاجلا من طرف كل من يضع أمن هذا البلدين الصديقين واستتباب الاستقرار فيهما فوق أي اعتبار آخر. وهذا هو الحال بالنسبة لبلدي. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Attar for his statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Moussa Timothy Kaba, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting to discuss the security situation in Ukraine at the request of 6 Council members. I thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his comprehensive and sovereign briefing. I also join to welcome the participation of President Zelensky to today's meeting. As the war in Ukraine enters its 941st day, Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned about the continuous aerial attacks on heavily populated areas in cities and towns, causing untold suffering to civilians who find themselves trapped in this conflict. Sierra Leone takes note of the Ukraine letter of 19th September 2024, reporting on a guided aerial attack on a geriatric home in Sumy on the 19th of September, which was home to 221 elderly people, of whom more than 80 are bedridden, as well as 60 staff members. The attack reportedly killed one elderly person and injured at least 13 others. The facility suffered significant structural damage and 147 people had to be evacuated. The Russian Federation has similarly reported that there has been shelling on populated areas over the weekend in the Belgorod neighborhood in Russia and Russian-occupied areas in Ukraine, resulting in at least one civilian death and at least 14 injuries. We also take note of the Russian Federation's letter dated 20th September 2024, together with its enclosure detailing attacks on Russian civilians and civilian facilities. Mr. President, the humanitarian impact of the Ukraine conflict has been devastating, resulting in higher numbers of civilian deaths, injuries, and displacement. There has been reports of massive infrastructural damage to homes, schools, hospitals, and health facilities, businesses, and other civilian infrastructure from aerial strikes in Ukraine over the course of this year. Tragically, several first responders to these attacks also lost their lives and suffered injuries from repeated attacks on the same site. These attacks have also damaged critical water and electricity infrastructure, causing widespread disruptions in services in several areas. For example, according to OCHA, an estimated 16,000 people still residing in Pokrovstown have been without water and gas for weeks since both systems were destroyed from ongoing fighting. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are particularly heinous and are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Mr. President, it is important for both parties to the conflict to de-escalate and prevent further harm to the lives and livelihoods of their citizens and other innocent civilians. Civilians in frontline communities have had to relocate several times, and humanitarian relief efforts are also being hindered by the extending and shifting front lines. In this regard, we call on the parties to the conflict to exercise maximum restraint. The continued escalation of this conflict presents a clear and present threat of not only drawing other countries in the region into the conflict, but also the possibility of triggering a nuclear catastrophe with an unintended strike on a nuclear facility, all of which will cause irreversible damage to efforts to bring the conflict to an end. Failure to take necessary action towards a political solution for the peaceful resolution of the conflict also presents the Council as ineffective and indifferent in achieving its mandate and addressing the suffering of millions of men, women, and children. Mr. President, the international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of an amicable and sustainable peace in Ukraine. It is equally important for this Council to speak with one voice in the interest of global peace and security and intensify efforts to mediate between the two conflicting parties, as well as encourage measures geared towards de-escalation and cessation of the hostilities and peaceful resolution of the conflict. In closing, Sierra Leone once more calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation within their internationally recognized borders, and for genuine diplomatic efforts to achieve a peaceful and lasting solution to the conflict, taking into account the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kaba for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. David Lammy, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary General, for your briefing on the grim realities of this war. President Zelensky, the UK commends you not only for standing up for your people, but for standing up for democracy. Seeing you in Kyiv a few weeks ago with Secretary Blinken, I saw ordinary people from all walks of life, the soldiers and the civilians, the firefighters and the first responders, the mothers and the fathers, working together in defense of freedom. Your bravery and courage is an inspiration to us all. But, Mr. President, I also want to speak directly to the Kremlin and its representative here today. And Vladimir Putin, Russia sits on this council, but its actions tear up the UN Charter. Russia sits on this council, but over the weekend we saw it put forward amendments designed to wreck the UN's future. Russia claims to stand for the global south, but it runs roughshod over international law. Vladimir Putin, when you fire missiles into Ukraine hospitals, we know who you are. When you send mercenaries into African countries, we know who you are. When you murder opponents in European cities, we know who you are. Your invasion is in your own interests, yours alone, to expand your mafia state into a mafia empire, an empire built on corruption, robbing from the Russian people as well as Ukraine, an empire built on crushing dissent, courageous opponents like Navalny, an empire built on lies, spreading disinformation at home and abroad to sow disorder. Mr. President, I speak not only as a Briton, as a Londoner, and as a Foreign Secretary, but I say to the Russian representative on his phone as I speak that I stand here also as a black man whose ancestors were taken in chains from Africa at the barrel of a gun to be enslaved, whose ancestors rose up and fought in a great rebellion of the enslaved. Imperialism, I know it when I see it, and I will call it out for what it is. In this week, when I'm here talking to other partners around the world about our shared futures and the future of the UN, Russia is trying to return us to a world of the past, a world of imperialism, a world of redrawing borders by force, a world without the UN Charter. We cannot allow this to happen. Ukraine's fight matters to all of us. The UK will remain Ukraine's staunchest supporter. Because, Mr. President, these are the stakes. If we let an imperialist redraw borders by force, those will not be the last borders to be redrawn. If we let an imperialist deny a nation its path, Ukraine will not be the last state to be subjected. Maduro will take encouragement and go for Guyana next. So let me be clear, we want peace in Ukraine. We want it for the Ukrainian people. As President Zelensky has said, it must be a peace that respects the fundamental principles that underpin the United Nations, the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, as enshrined in this UN Charter, the Charter of the United Nations. Putin's Russia wants to unravel it. We want to uphold it, and we will. As President Zelensky said, the UN Charter will prevail. Slava Ukraini.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lammy for his statement and give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Kahory Takeshi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan. Minister of Japan.
Mr. President, I thank you and the delegation of Slovenia for organizing this important meeting. More than 2.5 years have passed since Russia launched its brutal aggression against Ukraine. Japan again condemns Russia's aggression in the strongest possible terms and repeatedly demands its withdrawal from Ukraine. First and foremost, please allow me, on behalf of the government of Japan, to pay tribute to and express solidarity with President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, who have been fighting to uphold the inalienable principles of the UN Charter for the political independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of their country since the start of the aggression. Today, Japan reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine. As the aggression continues and civilian casualties mount day by day, Russia's attacks targeting critical infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, and power plants are threatening the future of the Ukrainian people. Russia must uphold its obligations under international humanitarian law. Deliberate and indiscriminate attacks on civilian targets are in flagrant violation of international law and constitute war crimes. Japan condemns Russia's illegal abduction of children who should bear the future of Ukraine. We strongly urge Russia to release all persons unjustly detained and to safely return all civilians illegally transferred or deported. The damaging impacts of Russia's war of aggression go well beyond Ukraine. In addition to the mass displacement of people from Ukraine, we are witnessing the dire consequences of food and energy insecurity, particularly in vulnerable and developing countries. Japan commits to protecting the human dignity of those made vulnerable due to the conflict, including women and children, and to continue its support to them. It is unacceptable that a permanent member of the Security Council, on which the UN Charter confirms the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, is continuing to disregard international law by attempting to unilaterally change the status quo by force. In fact, Russia has violated Security Council resolutions it had voted in favor of by procuring ballistic missiles from North Korea and using them against Ukraine. In addition, we are deeply concerned about Iran's transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia. All UN member states must refrain from aiding Russia's aggression directly or indirectly. Furthermore, Japan condemns Russia's seizure and continued control and militarization of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. As the only country to have ever suffered atomic bombings during the war, Japan does not accept Russia's nuclear threats, let alone its use of nuclear weapons. In order to protect the international order based on the rule of law, it is essential to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the principles of the UN Charter. The overwhelming majority of the international community shares this view. The only country worthy of blame for the present situation of Ukraine is Russia. UN member states, including the members of the Security Council, should make it clear that it was Russia that started this unjustified war of aggression. The rule of law is indispensable for multilateralism, and the United Nations should embody multilateralism. For this cause, all nations must fulfill their responsibilities to strengthen the governance of the United Nations. In order to reflect the realities of the 21st century and effectively maintain international peace and security, strengthening the functions of the United Nations, including through Security Council reform, is necessary. Japan is determined to continue exercising leadership to this end. In conclusion, Mr. President, as a country determined to seriously contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security, Japan once again strongly calls on Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine. Japan will stand with Ukraine so that peace and justice prevail. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Akahori for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Manuel Gonçalves, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Mozambique.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Slovenia Presidency for convening this high-level briefing on security situation in Ukraine. We wish also to thank the Secretary General for his statement and for convening the urgency of the situation in Ukraine. As the conflict in Ukraine approaches its 3rd year, we observe with deep concern that armed hostilities continue to prevail over calls for peace, and the situation remains dire with significant humanitarian impacts. The international community remains apprehensive about the potential for wider conflict in Europe. There is a growing sense of unease regarding the escalation of tension. It is imperative to acknowledge that the world faces a critical juncture where we risk failing in our commitment, I quote, to succeed generations for the scars of war, end of quote. The potential consequence of such failure could surpass the devastation witnessed in previous global conflicts. Mr. President, we convene today in wake of a landmark adoption of the Pact of the Future. However, we must recognize that if immediate action is not taken to solve the conflicts, the future will seek to secure for subsequent generations may be imperiled not only for Ukraine, but globally. This conflict between the two nations with an intertwined history and kinship has placed considerably a strain on our global architecture for peace and security, as well as on our shared principle of humanity. Against this backdrop, as we stand at the crossroad of history, confronted with the superb reality of war and the threat of global conflict, it's crucial to reaffirm the fundamental values that bind us. We strongly advocate for primacy for resolved dialogue, to reasoned dialogue of the use of force. Our collective strength and hope for peace lie in our unwavering commitment to diplomacy, the principle of ensuring in UN Charter, international law, and mechanisms for peaceful resolution of disputes. Mr. President, drawing from our national historical experience, we affirm that the use of force invariably leads to destruction. Such actions exacerbate divisions, fuel resentment, and inflict untold suffering on the most vulnerable members of our society. It is our firm belief that violence, regardless of its justification by any part, cannot establish the condition necessary for lasting peace. It is through reasoned dialogue, patient, principled approach, and determined pursuit of justice and mutual understanding that we can build the foundation of a world where the future generation are safeguarded from the threat of armed conflict. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine serves as the stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the immense responsibility we bear to protect it. We are confronted daily with alarming risk of escalation, including unimaginable aspect of nuclear confrontation. We must therefore categorically reject the temptation of counter force with force. Instead, we must rely behind the very principles that have guided us for over 7 decades. respect of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peaceful resolution of disputes. Let us reaffirm the solemn commitment made by founders of these institutions to save, succeed generation from scourge for the war. This is not an abstraction. It is our collective responsibility and mission. It calls upon each member state to transcend immediate political consideration, to act with reason and restraint, and to recognize that our shared humanity surpassed any reflecting potential gain. Together, we must redouble our effort to facilitate peace, foster dialogue, and support every initiative that seeks to end hostility and restore hope. Mr. President, tomorrow this chamber will convene for an open debate on maintenance of international peace and security, focused on the theme, leadership for peace. We must remain vigilant against the perils of hubris in leadership and heed the call we collectively endorsed in the Pact for the Future to guarantee a better future for current and future generations. Let us, guided by noble tasks for ensuring that the legacy we leave behind is one of peace, stability, and dignity for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Gonçalves for his statement and give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jamie Barberis, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente, comienzo por agradecer al Secretario General Antonio Guterres por sus incansables esfuerzos por la paz y reconocer la presencia de altas autoridades en esta Cámara, a quienes mi delegación ha escuchado y continuará escuchando con respeto. Comparezco ante este Consejo con un profundo sentido de responsabilidad y conciencia sobre el estado de la fragilidad en que se encuentra la paz y la seguridad a nivel mundial. La guerra en Ucrania, cuyo impacto sigue causando sufrimiento humano y una creciente inestabilidad global, supone otro interrogante a la credibilidad de este Consejo para cumplir con su responsabilidad primordial de mantener la paz y seguridad internacionales. La Carta de las Naciones Unidas continúa siendo el faro que debe guiarnos hacia la consecución de una paz global duradera. Sus propósitos y principios nos recuerdan la necesidad de evitar los errores y horrores del pasado, por lo que es nuestra responsabilidad colectiva defenderla. Reafirmo el compromiso inquebrantable de mi país con los principios fundamentales del derecho internacional. El respeto a la soberanía, la integridad territorial y la independencia política de los Estados no es negociable. El párrafo 4 del artículo 2 de la Carta es meridianamente claro y no hay disposición alguna que admita o legitime el uso o amenaza del uso de la fuerza como un medio para resolver disputas entre las naciones. Es por ello que desde el inicio del conflicto en febrero de 2022, mi país ha mantenido una posición firme y coherente apegada al derecho internacional y a la Carta. Hemos condenado la invasión a Ucrania y apoyado de manera consistente las resoluciones adoptadas por la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas, así como las medidas provisionales ordenadas a la Federación de Rusia por la Corte Internacional de Justicia en marzo de 2022. Señor Presidente, las comunidades afectadas por el conflicto enfrentan una crisis humanitaria sin precedentes. Los ataques contra civiles e infraestructura civil continúan devastando vidas y destruyendo medios de subsistencia, incluso más allá de las fronteras de Ucrania. El Ecuador ha llamado a las partes a proteger a los civiles, a alejar a los combates de las zonas pobladas, a resguardar las infraestructuras civiles y acatar los principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución, como lo dicta el derecho internacional humanitario. Además, mi país ha llamado a la aplicación de la resolución 2730 y aquellas relativas a la protección del personal humanitario y al personal de las Naciones Unidas. La facilitación del acceso sin trabas de la ayuda humanitaria a todas las zonas y afectadas es imperativa. Señor presidente, el impacto de este conflicto no se limita a las fronteras de Rusia y Ucrania. Las consecuencias económicas, energéticas y alimentarias de la guerra afectan a los países en desarrollo, comprometiendo los esfuerzos globales para alcanzar los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Es igualmente necesario advertir el riesgo de que esta guerra desemboque en un conflicto más amplio. La intensificación de las hostilidades amenaza con llevarnos hacia un escenario de confrontación con consecuencias inconmensurables. Ante ello, el llamado del secretario general de las Naciones Unidas a fin de que las hostilidades y los esfuerzos de actores internacionales que buscan poner fin a este conflicto deben respaldarse. Reitero la disposición del Ecuador de apoyar toda iniciativa encaminada a restaurar la paz y la seguridad en Ucrania y en la región. El diálogo y la diplomacia no pueden ser consideradas líneas rojas. Señor presidente, excelencias, la experiencia del Ecuador ha demostrado que incluso los conflictos más antiguos encontraron solución a través del diálogo y de la diplomacia. Si bien somos conscientes de la complejidad de la situación en Ucrania y de las tensiones geopolíticas que la rodean, es aquella experiencia la que nos lleva al convencimiento de que se puede encontrar una solución pacífica en Ucrania. Este Consejo tiene la responsabilidad histórica de construir la búsqueda de soluciones pacíficas, en rechazar el uso de la fuerza como medio para resolver disputas y en trabajar por un mundo en el que prevalezca la seguridad colectiva. Por ello, para terminar, el Ecuador se une el llamado a la Federación Rusa a terminar sus operaciones militares en Ucrania, de manera que se pueda avanzar sin más demora hacia una solución negociada conducente a una paz sostenible basada en el derecho internacional y los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchísimas gracias.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Barberis for his statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, красноречивому британскому министру, который преподавал нам уроки империализма. От кого бы мы это слышали? Я рекомендую прочитать нашу поправку к Пакту будущего, основанную на главе 2.7 Устава ООН. Пусть он для начала с ней ознакомится, а потом расскажет, что его там не устраивает. Может быть, ссылка на Устав ООН? Он, правда, уже ретировался, но я надеюсь, ему передадут наши пожелания. Господин председатель, сегодня на наших глазах происходит абсолютно ужасная, бесчеловечная военная кампания. Генеральный секретарь ООН в начале октября описал ее так, цитирую: «За весь свой мандат в качестве генерального секретаря я никогда не сталкивался с таким уровнем страданий, количеством жертв и разрушений, которые произошли за последние месяцы». Конец цитаты. Этот конфликт уже унес жизни почти 42 тысяч человек, включая 300 с лишним гуманитарных работников. Территория, на которой проживают 2 миллиона человек, превращена в руины и стала непригодной для жизни на долгие годы, а возможно и десятилетия. Антонио Гутерреш ранее называл эту зону детским кладбищем. Столько там погибло женщин и детей. И несмотря на это, Совет безопасности ООН вот уже почти год не может добиться там прекращения огня, о котором просят все без исключения гуманитарные работники. Из-за позиции одного постоянного члена Совета безопасности, который ради этого применял право вето 5 раз. Думаю, всем понятно, что мы говорим не об Украине, а о кризисе в Газе. Чтобы разница между ними была еще более наглядной, достаточно вспомнить, что год назад, после начала израильской операции в секторе, На Украину переехало несколько тысяч израильтян украинского происхождения, решив, что там им будет безопаснее. Ведь жители Украины прекрасно знают, что Россия не наносит ударов по гражданским объектам, если их не используют в военных целях. И все подобные раскручиваемые украинской властью инциденты происходят из-за работы украинской ПВО и ее размещения в жилых кварталах украинских городов. В этих обстоятельствах очевидно, почему весь мир ждал, что Совет Безопасности соберет высокопоставленных гостей Нью-Йорка для обсуждения именно ситуации в Газе. Тем более, что вызванные ею тектонические толчки грозят втянуть весь ближневосточный регион от Ливана до Ирана и Йемена в крупный и ожесточенный региональный конфликт. Только за последние 2 дня от израильских ударов погибло почти 600 ливанцев. Но западные члены Совета заранее забронировали этот зал именно для пиар-бенефиса просроченного украинского президента. И если бы не арабские развивающиеся страны, запросившие заседание на 27 сентября, Совет Безопасности вообще бы не обсудил Газу в ходе этой недели. Все это выглядит еще более нелицеприятно для Совета, поскольку происходящее вокруг Украины всем нам предельно понятно. Вот краткое содержание для вас. Киевский режим, пришедший к власти в результате инспирированного Западом в 2014 году государственного переворота, сразу же развязал кровавую гражданскую войну против не пожелавших расставаться со своей идентичностью и чтить нацистских коллаборантов жителей юга и востока страны. Из-за этого майданная власть почти сразу же потеряла Крым. Тогда, в 2015 году, этот конфликт был заморожен подписанием Минского комплекса мер, одобренного Советом Безопасности ООН. Однако новые украинские власти, вместо того, чтобы выполнять этот документ, всячески саботировали его, активно вооружались и готовились к войне с Россией при помощи Соединенных Штатов и их союзников, в чем признался целый ряд отставных западных политиков. После того, как режим в Киеве категорически отказался выполнять Минские договоренности, а его западные спонсоры отвергли любой диалог с Россией по вопросам европейской безопасности, наша страна, столкнувшись с резкой активизацией украинских ударов по мирным городам республик Донбасса, приняла решение начать специальную военную операцию. Она могла закончиться уже спустя месяц, когда российская армия стояла на окраинах Киева. Однако Запад отговорил киевского главаря подписывать парафированный Украиной в Стамбуле проект мирного договора, пообещав всячески поддерживать украинскую армию, которая якобы в этом случае сможет нанести поражение России на поле боя. Однако, несмотря на обильные поставки вооружений, в том числе дальнобойных, снабжение развединформацией, целенаведение, отправку наемников и инструкторов и фактически прямое участие Запада в конфликте с целью нанести России жизнями украинцев стратегическое поражение, украинская армия сегодня оказалась на грани полного разгрома. Для того, чтобы убедиться в этом, достаточно изучить военные сводки, свидетельствующие о стремительном обрушении фортификационных линий Киева на Восточном фронте, на возведение которых потребовалось почти 8 лет. Для полноты картины нужно также учитывать то, что набор новых рекрутов, которых режим Зеленского бросает на верную погибель в бессмысленную мясорубку, осуществляется почти исключительно силовым путем в результате облав, видеосъемками которых, размещаемыми возмущенными украинскими гражданами, заполнен украинский сегмент интернета. Иными словами, украинцы не хотят идти воевать, всеми силами пытаются сбежать из страны, а попав на фронт без должной подготовки, пытаются либо дезертировать, либо сдаться в плен. Если бы не стреляющие им в спины заградотряда из отмороженных националистов, счет пленных уже шел бы на десятки тысяч. По этой же причине был провален в прошлом году пресловутый контрнаступ, на который возлагали такие надежды спонсоры Зеленского и его клики.
And his clique pinned such great hopes. Understanding all of this, the head of the Kiev junta has decided to make use of the sole remaining chance to cling to power and to avoid reprisals from his own compatriots, namely by dragging the West into a direct confrontation with Russia. A large-scale provocation such as Bucha would have fit the bill. However, this was so clumsy, so unpersuasive that it is clear that a new one would not be persuasive either. The other option would be to provoke a strong response after strikes with long-range Western weapons targeting objects deep within Russian territory, and then to cry wolf. However, Western leaders whose self-preservation instinct has not completely deteriorated have not yet taken this decision, or in any event, they are not eager to announce this. And for this reason, the Kiev strongman decided to go all in, and having lulled everybody with ruminations about peace, decided to engage in the reckless attack on peaceful Russian border regions. However, here too, things did not go as planned. He did not achieve his goals, and he was forced to spend valuable human resources and Western equipment, which was in short supply in Kursk Oblast at the time when the destruction and collapse of the Eastern Front is ongoing at an unprecedented tempo. And here he's in New York, once again with an extended hand, attempting to persuade the West to raise the stakes in the conflict with Russia and to throw their own sons to certain death in Ukraine, thereby becoming direct party to the conflict with a nuclear power. Zelensky does not have anything to lose, but the U.S. and allies naturally do. And they are perfectly aware of the cost that they could pay for such an attempt to save the Ukrainian deadweight, the suitcase without handles. Mr. President, now the actor, Vladimir Zelensky, is playing a role of the cool guy, the West's ally, and something even of a savior of all humankind against the Russian threat. He has close ties with notorious Russophobes and fervent nationalists who imbibed with their mother's milk the ideas of Bandera and other Hitlerite henchmen. However, the character before us far from always played this role. To understand who we are dealing with, let's consider briefly his political persona over the past decade. In the past, before being elected president, and at the initial stage of the leadership of the country, Mr. Zelensky was actually quite critical about the coup in 2014. He called for an objective investigation into its dark chapters. Himself a Russian language speaker, in 2014, he uttered the following words, and I quote, "If in the east of Ukraine and Crimea people wish to speak in Russian, back off, let them be. Let them speak in Russian lawfully. Language will never divide our motherland," end of quote. At the height of his election campaign in 2014, he announced that the oppression of the Russian language was unacceptable. He spoke of the need to guarantee that the Russian language develop on equal footing with others. Furthermore, he promised to ensure a lasting ceasefire in Donbass. It is hardly surprising that this program was appreciated by Ukrainian voters, and he received 3/4 of their votes. Naturally, the fact that he gave interviews in Russia also had an effect. He promised not to impose a cult of Nazi henchmen on those who do not regard them as heroes, and he promised that he would force a silencing of weapons in the east of the country, where the Ukrainian armed forces had for 5 years by that time been shelling peaceful cities, murdering women, the elderly, and children. However, after the presidential victory, he began to play a different role and failed to meet a single one of his promises, to honor a single one of his promises. We can see how he gradually betrayed the Ukrainian people and destroyed their statehood for the advancement of the interests of Western sponsors. In his inaugural speech, he announced that the Ukrainian state needs to fight for the hearts and souls of the people of Donbass, not just for territory. Soon after assuming the oath of office, he began to sabotage the implementation of the Minsk agreements. He supported myriad extremist laws against the Russian language and Russian speakers, and then simply advised that the residents of southeast Ukraine who view themselves as Russians to move to Russia. He called them specimens. And we would like to ask Mr. Zelensky, it's no longer possible since he has left, who today called for respect for the Charter of the United Nations. How are these actions in accordance with the Charter of the UN? How is it in accordance with the violations of basic human rights which have been carried out by the leadership of that state? Or are you ready to note that in that document only those parts that pertain to territorial integrity, instead of eliminating the root causes of the internal crisis in Ukraine, which triggered the civil war? The new president of Ukraine decided to exacerbate it. In the country, essentially, a language inquisition was unleashed with punishments for the use of the Russian language, which is the mother tongue of the majority of Ukrainians. Even before Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, the opposition was effectively destroyed. Independent media outlets were shuttered. The canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church was repressed. Nationalist and neo-nationalist groups flourished. Anything that in any way, in one way or another, linked Ukraine to Russia was effectively made illegal. History was rewritten. Children were indoctrinated with delusional theories about thousands-year-old Ukrainian civilization from which Jews and Portuguese and French originated. This is not a joke. It is not a fake. This is written in geography books for the 8th class in a Ukrainian middle school, and we showed it here in this chamber. Mr. President, in the West's battle cries, Ukraine is portrayed as some kind of an innocent victim of Russia's aggression, and the United States and allies are portrayed as peacekeepers. Nothing is further from the truth than these assertions. Ukraine, under the neo-Nazi Kiev regime, became a one-man dictatorship, willing, for the sake of preserving his power and blind obedience to the West, not just to drown his whole country in blood and to sacrifice all young Ukrainians who were unable to flee the country, but also willing to push the world into the abyss of a third world war. And just a few years ago, Mr. Zelensky said the following, and I quote, "I can assure you, for our heroes to not die any longer, I am willing to do anything, and I certainly am not afraid of taking difficult decisions. Without hesitation, I am willing to leave my post, if only for the advent of peace," unquote. Now these words appear to be from the realm of fantasy. That is how irrelevant they have become, given the dismally low levels of support for him from his population. He has an animal fear of being stripped of power because he understands that he will be held accountable for all the crimes which he perpetrated during his presidency. Let us recall, regular elections were scheduled to be held on 31 March, but Zelensky canceled them under the pretext of a state of war, and this runs counter to the basic law of the country. After 20 May, this year, when the presidential powers should have, according to the Constitution, been transferred to the Speaker of the Upper Rada, the head of the Kiev junta, transformed into a conventional usurper of power. On the 28th of August, the authorities of the 9th session of the Rada expired, incidentally. In the 5 years of his presidential term, he brought the country entrusted to him to an abyss, having sold off Ukraine to Western corporations, having destroyed its economy, and having plunged it into a horrific demographic crisis. President Biden today at the General Assembly spoke about the need to save the Ukrainian nation. The Ukrainian nation is not threatened with anything. We are not fighting against it. We are fighting against a criminal regime which seized power in Kyiv, which is bringing its people towards catastrophe. And this is not a war for territory, regardless of the claims of our foes. This is a struggle for acknowledgement and people's rights. Mr. President, a just and lasting resolution to the Ukrainian crisis is only possible if the root causes are eradicated. First and foremost, with an end to violations of the rights of Russian language people and a repeal in Ukraine of other discriminatory laws. Today, we hear from many corners, we hear calls for a political diplomatic solution on the basis of the UN Charter. However, without overcoming the legacy of Maidan, without eradicating nationalism, Nazism, and other manifestations of discrimination in Ukraine, respect for the rights and basic freedoms of all without distinction as to race, gender, language, and religion, in accordance with Article 1.3 of the Charter of the United Nations, there will be no resolution. It would not be possible. And yet, we have not heard about this either from our Western colleagues or from the UN Secretary General, nor did we hear from them another important premise, namely that the purposes and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations need to be complied with fully in their integrity and interrelated nature. Beyond provisions about respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, there's also the principle there of self-determination of peoples, and this under no circumstances can be overlooked, nor should the responsibility of states for all of its citizens, the citizens of their state, be overlooked either. We hope that the Kyiv regime will not be able to completely destroy their country and their people, which they're close to doing, nor push the world into the abyss of nuclear catastrophe. For that, they should embrace realistic parameters for a long-term resolution to the Ukrainian crisis rather than falling back on unrealistic ultimatums, victory plans, and so on. The cost, the price for such criminal, flippant arrogance is paid by ordinary Ukrainians whose resistance to the high-handed Ukrainian Kyiv clique is visibly growing. The Russian Federation was always ready to live in peace and good neighborly relations with Ukraine until it was shaped into aggressive, Russophobic, neo-Nazi wasp's nest, threatening our security, and before the design of plans to drag it into a militaristic, the militaristic NATO bloc. We always respect Ukrainians. These are a brotherly people with whom we are tied with unbreakable historic ties. Millions of them found shelter in Russia. If the Western camp does not abandon this, does not excise this cancerous tumor of the current Kyiv regime peacefully, if Washington and satellites geopolitical economic considerations do not continue to supersede the salvation of the country, we will continue our SMO until its objectives are met militarily, and there is no other way towards peace. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. Before continuing, please let me read this time limit reminder. This meeting needs to conclude by 6 p.m. I would like to remind all the speakers that there is a time limit of 3 minutes in place to be able to conclude the meeting within the allotted time frame. You may send your full statement for publication as an official Security Council document with a letter addressed to the President. And now I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Gitanas Nausėda, President of the Republic of Lithuania.
Your Excellency, Prime Minister of the Republic of Slovenia, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We came here to discuss maintaining peace and security of Ukraine. Before turning our attention to the future, I suggest that we also talk about the past and the present. Ukraine had been perfectly secure from external threats before this security was snatched away. Before the illegal occupation of Crimea, before the invasion into Donbass, before the whole-scale war of aggression in 2022. Right now, Ukraine has neither peace nor security. And it is Russia, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, that is directly responsible for putting not only European, but global peace and security under threat. Let me remind you that this great organization was created to prevent both wars of aggression and war crimes. The peoples of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That is how the United Nations Charter begins. And we continue to fulfill that promise to this very day. It is truly the shame that Russia is still able to hide behind the veto power and actively uses this power to cover crimes of its partners. Each and every person in this room knows about Kremlin's many crimes. I won't repeat the whole list now. What the Baltic states demand is accountability. The whole political and military leadership of Russia must be held accountable, as well as their major accomplices. Special international tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine must be established. War criminals must be arrested under ICC arrest warrants by the countries that have ratified the Rome Statute. The Baltic states acknowledge that there will be no true accountability without Ukraine's decisive victory. Peace can only be achieved through the full restoration of Ukraine's territory within its internationally recognized borders. Security can only be guaranteed by Russia's acknowledgement that it will never prevail over the brave Ukrainian people. Therefore, it is the duty of the international community to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, until its final victory. Thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency President Nauseda for his statement. And now I give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Luminița Teodora Odobescu, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Romania.
Thank you. Mr. President, Russia's aggression against Ukraine undermines with every passing day the effective and rules-based multilateralism with UN at its core. We are here today in the Security Council to stand by our neighbor Ukraine, by the UN Charter and international law, and echo again that there is only one way to end the aggression against Ukraine. Here is how. Russia must abide the rules of international law. It must unconditionally cease the use of force and withdraw completely and immediately from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, and its sovereign right to freely choose its own pathway should be respected by all UN member states. Ukraine has the legitimate right to defend itself against the Russian aggression. During the current illegal military aggression, innocent civilians were killed. Furthermore, Russia has been using a wide array of war techniques, from irresponsible threat of the nuclear option and disinformation to the destruction of energy infrastructure and violating the basic principle of freedom of navigation. The recent strike by Russia against a cargo ship loaded with Ukrainian grain in the Black Sea represents another example of its aggressive actions in the region. Romania will continue to remain committed to enhance the transit capacity of Ukrainian goods via its Danube and Black Sea ports. In these grave circumstances, we have to make sure that justice is being served and accountability is duly pursued for all crimes committed against Ukraine, including the crime of aggression. The ongoing war is severely affecting the security of the wider Black Sea area, challenging the resilience of the neighboring states. We recall that Republic of Moldova's stability is critical for the entire region. Mr. President, peace in Ukraine cannot be restored by inaction. Romania tirelessly advocates for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter. Romania fully supports the peace formula of President Zelensky. One principle is crystal clear. Legally and morally, Ukraine alone has the political and moral legitimacy to decide if, when, and on what terms it wants to engage with the Russian Federation. What we wish for is simple and only natural: peace for the people of Ukraine and fully fledged respect for the UN Charter and the international law. This should be our joint objective and responsibility. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Sodobescu for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Péter Szijjártó, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary.
Madam Minister, dear Tanya, thank you so much for organizing this briefing. Dear colleagues, I'm representing a country which is a direct neighbor to Ukraine, a country which has been faced with the consequences of the war for the last 2.5 years, a country which has been paying the price of this war, although we do absolutely have no responsibility in this war being launched. After almost 1,000 days, I think the question is no more what we do think about the war, but the question is how peace will be made. Or even more precisely, Madam Minister, dear Chair, the question should read as which is the quickest way to peace. Because we do believe that we do have to reach peace in the fastest, in the quickest possible way. Because the later we come to peace, the more people will die, the more families will suffer, more people will have to escape, and the more destruction will take place. And we Hungarians in the neighborhood, we don't want more destruction to take place. We don't want more families to suffer. We don't want more people to die, especially that there's a significant community of Hungarians living in Ukraine. And if we are honest to ourselves, and if we don't use only panels of communication, then I think it's obvious that what has been done so far has not worked out at all from the perspective of peace. The weapon deliveries have absolutely not helped to bring this war closer to its conclusion. Weapon deliveries have absolutely not helped in bringing this war to an end. And the increase of the number of weapons on both sides of the front line ended up in more casualties and also the prolongation. And we are super concerned about the ever-growing risk of escalation, and we are absolutely concerned about the open references to the use of any type of nuclear weapons. We Hungarians argue in favor of ceasefire and peace talks to be started. We Hungarians do believe that this is the fastest way towards peace, especially that what has happened so far proves that there is no solution on the battlefield. What you have on the battlefield is casualties and destruction. And we Hungarians are proud to be among the global majority for peace, and we are ready to take part in all global initiatives which brings forward the hope for peace and strengthens the volume of peace. And we do hope that this high-level week of the General Assembly will bring us closer to the conclusion of the war, bring us closer to peace, and brings us closer to the end of the suffering of the people in our neighborhood. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sijarto for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Radoslaw Sikorski, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Madam President, Excellencies, the Russian ambassador predicted that this debate will consist of, quote, hackneyed statements dictated by Brussels. It's a lie. I assure you that what you're about to hear, I wrote myself. The Russian ambassador claims that Russia does not bomb civilian targets. That's a second lie. 2 weeks ago, I visited the Ukrainian city of Lviv, where a townhouse was hit with a Russian Kalibr missile. This is the result. A man saw his wife and 3 daughters taken out of the rubble dead. All of them were civilians. All of them lived far away from the front line, and all of them were killed. The Russian ambassador has talked about children's graveyard in Gaza, which is indeed a tragic situation. Well, Ukrainian children are targeted not only with bombs. Thousands have been kidnapped and taken into Russia, where they are brainwashed in order to strip them of memories and of their national identity. Russia claims that these children are orphans, left alone in a war zone. Another lie. Many of them were separated from their parents, either by accident during attacks or deliberately by the aggressor's army. Independent reports revealed that, and I quote, officials have deported Ukrainian children to Russia or Russian-held territories without consent, lied to them that they weren't wanted by their parents, used them for propaganda, and given them Russian families and citizenship. Special camps offer the abducted children Russian patriotic education, and a hotline was established to pair the minors with potential foster families, in inverted commas, luring the latter with money. On top of that, Mr. Putin signed a decree fast-tracking the process of granting Russian citizenship to stolen Ukrainian children. This is not collateral war damage. It was a plan devised before the war and ruthlessly executed. UN investigators concluded that these actions constitute war crimes. In October 2022, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. Ambassador Nebenzia and Russian propagandists like to refer to the democratically elected government of Ukraine as Nazis, as you've just heard. It so happens that in Poland, I live three kilometers from Potulice, the site of a former Nazi filtration camp during the Second World War. It's known for the fact that thousands of children were imprisoned there, from Poland and the Soviet Union, from around Smolensk and Vitebsk. Up to 800 of these children died, but thousands were transferred west to be Germanized. Blonde, blue-eyed, Aryan children deemed to be racially suitable. I therefore have a few questions to the Russian ambassador and his superiors. How does what you are doing to Ukrainian kidnapped children differ from what German Nazis did to your children and ours? How many Russian officials have adopted stolen Ukrainian children following, as reported by the BBC, the example of Sergei Mironov, former chairman of the Russian Federation Council? When will you return the remaining thousands of stolen Ukrainian children back to Ukraine? Do you know that stealing in other countries' children is tantamount to genocide, as recently reaffirmed by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe? Do you remember the diplomats and propagandists of a genocidal regime are also criminals, as Soviet prosecutors argued at Nuremberg with reference to Ribbentrop and Streicher. Permanent members of the UN Security Council are supposed to be guardians of peace and not to fight their wars with other people's children. This is Russia's shame that will not be forgiven or forgotten. And by the way, since Ambassador Nebenzia denies the reality of Soviet Nazi collaboration in the invasion of Poland in 1939, here are pictures of their joint parade. I'm sure you recognize the Soviet uniforms. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sikorski for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Juraj Blanar, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovakia.
Thank you, Madam President, Excellencies, dear colleagues. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to take the floor as a direct neighbor of Ukraine and deliver the key message on behalf of Slovakia. Now I would like to focus on 3 points. Firstly, to reiterate our principal position. Slovakia supports the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized border as a matter of principle. Borders must be respected and cannot be changed by force. The sovereignty of all must be respected. These are key provisions of the UN Charter, essential for the global stability and predictability of international relations. Since we did not recognize the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo, we also do not recognize the annexation of Crimea region of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporozhye. Secondly, on continued peace efforts. More than 2.5 years since the invasion, we have no firm commitment from global powers to the peace process. Divisions within this Council are deepening. Its role as a protector of peace is being questioned. Slovakia calls on all the stakeholders to put aside their differences and focus on stopping the human suffering and destruction of Ukraine. There is no alternative to dialogue, as the situation cannot be resolved by the military means alone. The war against Ukraine, as well as in Gaza, has dire global consequences for global food and energy security and the supply routes. And when we talk about the peace, we must be very specific. A lasting, just peace for Ukraine cannot be achieved outside of the key principles of the UN Charter. Slovakia stands ready to support any meaningful process or format for respects these principles. The process will determine the outcome. This conflict cannot be solved unless the competition of global powers is replaced by their cooperation and return to diplomacy. Let me finish this part of about the peace by using of the words of Albert Einstein. Peace cannot be kept by force. It cannot only be achieved by understanding. Thirdly, the future of Ukraine is in the European Union. My government supports a peaceful, independent, sovereign, democratic and prosperous Ukraine with a stable, internationally recognized borders and firmly advancing on its reform path towards future European Union membership. Yesterday, I spoke at the G7 Plus meeting about the continued support for Ukraine ahead of upcoming winter. We keep providing emergency volumes of electricity, gas and diesel fuel to minimize power and heat outages in Ukraine. People are our primary concern. To this end, the third joint meeting of the governments of Slovakia and Ukraine, Slovak and Ukraine governments will soon take place with the aim of speeding up the implementation of the roadmap signed by our prime ministers earlier this year, focusing on strategic infrastructure and connectivity. Slovakia remains engaged to provide solidarity to people in Ukraine as well as in Gaza and Sudan. Thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Blana for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Josep Borrell, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, we meet today as a permanent member of this Council. Russia continues carrying a brutal, unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. As many have said today, it's a blatant violation of the United Nations Charter. Russia launched a war against Ukraine. It is the first interstate war in Europe since World War II. And Ukraine defends itself in line with its right to self-defense under the United Nations Charter, and it does so against a nuclear-armed state. The international community must remain determined to support Ukraine's freedom, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized border. Some has declared here today that they love peace. Oh yes, they love peace. No one loves peace more than the Ukrainians. And they want peace quickly, the quickest possible way. But they haven't mentioned that the quickest possible way is Russia withdrawing their troops from Ukraine. This would be the quickest possible way. Yes, there is another way, Ukrainian surrender. But we don't want this kind of ending the war. And they are desolated because the fact that we have been providing support to Ukraine has not finished the war. No, but it has allowed Ukraine to defend itself. And we want Ukraine to continue defending itself. So to all lovers of peace, please take into consideration that it matters the way this war is going to end. It matters. And one way of ending this war, which is Ukrainian surrender in front of the violation of their territorial integrity, will be a good example for the perpetrator of this violation to start again and again. So please, my call to all peace lovers is to keep in mind that what we are talking about is about the freedom of one country, one people, who is defending itself against an aggressor. United Nations reports are unequivocal. The deliberate destruction of civilian homes and infrastructures, depriving the civilian population of services necessary for its survival, particularly when the winter season starts and 2/3 of electricity production capacity of the country has been destroyed. The recent transfer of short-range ballistic missiles by Iran to Russia, and in doing also with North Korea, is becoming an enabler of Russian aggression. And this represents a substantive material escalation and a direct threat to European security. These weapons will be likely used against Ukrainian civilians, adding another layer of suffering and destruction of this war. The European Union remains unwavering in its support for Ukraine and to a just and lasting peace, yes, because we want peace. We too want peace, but based on international law and the United Nations Charter, and do more than 110 partners who supported the summit joint communique of this last meeting on a peace framework supporting, again, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of an aggressor country. At the end of the day, it's up to Ukraine, and only to Ukraine, to define the terms in which they want this war eventually end. And we need to pay more attention at the constant violations of the embargo against Russia. We need to be concerned by the circumvention of sanctions that these, yes, are making the war longer. And we have to reinforce the legitimacy of our support to Ukraine by being consistent with our values and applying these values everywhere. This is the best way of supporting Ukraine. Consistency is of the essence. In a world that is becoming less multilateral and more transactional, and in order to prevent this slide toward more transactions and less norms, we need to work very hard. This is the best way to support Ukraine for a peace, a just peace, that makes the aggressor to fail. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Borrell for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, colleagues, dear Madam President. 943 days ago, Russia launched its full-scale aggression against Ukraine. 943 days of suffering. 943 days of women being raped in Bucha, of tortured people in eastern Ukraine, and of children being deported. And as we have heard here today, there's no denying of that. Children being deported from their homes, as my Polish colleague has outlined. We heard here the Russian ambassador that he didn't even say this is not true. He said it's better for the children. There's an estimation that more than 20,000 children have been deported. Imagine these were your children, and you hear here in the Security Council that this is for the better good of your child being stolen from you as a mother or a father. I had the chance to speak one of the very, very few teenager girls who could be returned. She was telling me in tears, please promise me one thing. You won't stop, you won't stay silent until all the other girls, all the other boys, the little children have been returned. And this is our promise we gave. We as European neighbors, we as Germans, my country, what we heard here from our Polish friends, who were responsible for the worst crime on the European continent, who are lucky to live in peace again, my generation to live in peace again, because others were there for us, other European friends and partners, that my country could live in peace, reunified in the middle of Europe. And this is also my plea to those where I totally understand, who ask us, can you please stop this? Maybe it would help if you do not support Ukraine in self-defense. Maybe we should just ignore what's happening. We cannot do that, because my country pledged that we always stand up for the principles of this united nation. And we won't rest until these children are being back to their families. And yes, the Russian Federation, the ambassador who always leaves after he has spoken here, I've experienced that a couple of times, you can fool yourself. The strongest man of your country can hide behind teenager girls who he kidnapped. But you cannot fool the world. I mean, we don't have to go through all the 943 days of all the atrocities. We can all just remember what happened on Sunday here in New York. Russia wanted to prevent us from a real breakthrough for the UN. When a vast majority of states rallied around the values of the Charter, the fooling of the world happened just then, when Russia wanted to prevent us from a real breakthrough for the UN. And then we can read it all on Twitter. Their truth is that the majority from the, I quote, jungle was not capable of taking the right decision. This is how Putin's Russia these days speaks about other countries, the jungle. This is how they speak about Ukraine, a beauty which has to be raped. And this is how Putin's soldiers, Putin's army behaves. Every day, 943 days. Lately, with heavy drone attacks and missiles directly targeted power plants. 2/3 of electricity and heating is being destroyed right now, even though we try to protect it with air defense. 2/3 being destroyed, not by coincidence, but because winter is coming again. -15 degrees means that electricity doesn't work, heating doesn't work, and water is being frozen. This is a crime against humanity. People freezing to death. And this is why, again, I would like to call on all the friends around the world. We can totally understand that some of you think maybe if there is no weapon support anymore for Ukraine, maybe if we just call neutrally on all sides, this can go better. But I mean, the truth is, if there's no air defense left around the remaining electricity hubs, there's no electricity in Ukraine anymore. Then everything is being destroyed. And yes, we can call on both sides neutrally. But Vladimir Zelensky invited the Russian president to the negotiation table in summer. He offered a dialogue. And Vladimir Putin has responded with new levels of aggression. In June, Ukraine invited Russia to a second international peace conference. Putin's response, he bombed a children's hospital in Kiev. And this is why we believe we have to send further air defense to protect children's hospitals. And this is why we are on one hand very grateful that an increasing number of our partners in the world are thinking about how to end this war. We need this. We need an end to this war. But this cannot mean for us to stand by and watch while there is no end to this war, while Putin hasn't taken the seat at the negotiation table, to just stand by and watch Russia destroying the remaining half of Ukraine. For us, when we are speaking about peace, we believe it must be a just and lasting peace. Speaking about peace means Ukraine must be sure that the end of the fighting does not mean another round of preparations in Russia, neither another round in Ukraine, nor in Moldova, nor in Poland, like we've heard again from our colleague here at the table. Speaking about peace, just and lasting peace, means that Ukraine's existence as a free and independent country is guaranteed. It means security guarantees. This is hard, and every day people are dying. But Excellencies, on Sunday, we have showed what we can achieve if we join forces. We showed that those who want to destroy our charter will not succeed if we stand together and rally around the charter. Let's rally around the charter also for Ukraine in the same spirit, for just and lasting peace for Ukraine, for Europe, and the whole world. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Baerbock for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Lars Løkke Rasmussen, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. First of all, I extend a warm thanks to Slovenia for bringing leaders from across the world together I also want to thank the Secretary General for his insightful briefing, and to President Zelensky for outlining the situation in Ukraine and presenting the peace formula. Madam President, today marks 2 years and 7 months since Russia began its full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. This marked a major escalation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which started back in 2014. And this can, of course, not be tolerated. It must be condemned, and Russia and its representatives must be held accountable. Today, the Nordic countries would like to share 3 messages. Firstly, with its war of aggression, Russia is violating the most basic rules and principles of international law. It is deeply appalling that Russia, a permanent member of the Council, continues to disregard the UN Charter, which is the cornerstone of this institution. The vast destruction and the suffering of the Ukrainian people all stem from Russia's choice to continue its brutal aggression. The Nordic countries will continue to seek full accountability for the crimes committed, ensuring that Russia and its representatives are held to account in a shared responsibility of us all. Secondly, we repeat that Russia's war has grave consequences beyond the European continent. Earlier this month, a ship carrying grain was attacked in the Black Sea. We strongly condemn such attacks, which jeopardize global food supplies. Madam President, it is deeply concerning that Russia's systematic and damaging attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure continue. Civilians face immense hardship in Ukraine. Nearly 15 million people are already in need of humanitarian assistance. Russia's intensified attacks affect the lives of millions of people in Ukraine. Across all sectors of life, people lack access to water, electricity, and heating, and the winter is fast approaching. Ending this will require strong cross-regional support, and therefore we urge members to support Ukraine in defending its people and rebuilding its infrastructure, to uphold the UN Charter by holding Russia accountable, and to call for a fair and lasting peace. And this brings me to my third and last point. We need a comprehensive, just and sustainable peace based on international law, including the UN Charter. The Nordics firmly support President Zelensky's peace formula, and we encourage all member states to do the same. The Summit on Peace in June reconfirmed the strong support for the UN Charter and laid the foundation for the way forward. Any pathway to peace in Ukraine must be grounded in the UN Charter and its key principles, including Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Our commitment to the UN Charter and support for Ukraine remains resolute. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Rasmussen for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. At the beginning, I would like to thank also Secretary General for the comprehensive briefing. As we gather today in the Council, we confront the grim reality of the ongoing war heading towards its 4th year. This conflict inflicted profound suffering on millions in Ukraine and beyond. Unfortunately, since the beginning of the war, each day has taken us further from the peace. After almost 3 years of hostilities, hopes for an end to the conflict is low. Besides, risk of an uncontrolled escalation is still a fact. Escalation poses a threat not only to Europe, but to global stability. International community has so far tried to end the war primarily through coercive measures, but unfortunately these methods have yet to deliver. Whereas the UN Charter mandates peaceful resolutions to disputes, thus we must advocate for a just peace rooted in international law. We must reaffirm again and again our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. Security Council can bring its influence to bear to encourage the two sides back to the negotiating table. Ultimately, a just peace can only be achieved through direct dialogue and mutual understanding. This basic principle has shaped our approach to the conflict since the beginning. We maintain our position that diplomatic efforts and dialogue should constitute the focus of our endeavors. We continue to stand in full solidarity with the Crimean Tatar Turks in supporting their efforts to claim their rights. Madam President, above all, we must prevent at all costs the emergence of a new geopolitical fault line that will run through Ukraine and trigger a long-term global confrontation. It remains important to encourage the two sides to consider revitalizing the diplomatic track despite the current circumstances. Madam President, as all know, some Turkish initiatives in coordination with the UN yielded some important results, such as Black Sea Grain Initiative, exchange of prisoners of war, capturing sea mines, and some other initiatives are still pending, but we never give up trying. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Antonio Tajani, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy.
Thank you very much, Mrs. President. The Italian government, led by Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, has on many occasions, also in this room, started our clear position on the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Italy stands with Ukraine with the goal of a just peace. We stand with an invaded people fighting to defend their freedom and sovereignty. This is a key priority. At the United Nations, in the European Union, and as President of the G7 this year. Just in the last few days, here in New York, I chaired 2 G7 meetings on Ukraine. Supporting the defense of Kiev is crucial, but also is crucial to protect its infrastructures. Our support is focusing on the defense of Ukrainian territories. We are not at war with Russia. Our goal is to achieve peace. We are in favor of a conference of peace also with Russia, also with China, for achieving a good agreement, but peace is not a defeat of Ukraine. Peace is the freedom and integrity of Ukraine. I wish to express our full solidarity with the Ukrainian government and people for the current intense Russian attacks to the energy infrastructures. Winter is imminent. We are very concerned by the situation and we reaffirm our support to Ukraine and its energy sector. International humanitarian law calls for the respect of the energy infrastructures. As I started in our G7 Plus meeting on energy just yesterday, since the start of the war, Italy provided several hundred tons of materials, including generators. Italian government, together with our companies, contributed with important donations. In February, we signed an agreement with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development on €200 million project to restore the capacity of the main hydropower generating Ukrainian companies. We want to do more. President, Italy will host in 2025 the next Ukrainian Recovery Conference. Our focus is on peace. We want to avoid escalatory spirals. In our view, the solution involves starting a political and diplomatic process. Je souhaite maintenant m'adresser directement à mes collègues des pays partenaires.
I would now like to address our partners. We need to work in favor of a just peace and work in this direction. Rome will always be paying heed to such efforts, and we hope to see you all at the June summit, building on what was discussed in Switzerland. This includes food security and the humanitarian response. We are very concerned about the situation in Zaporizhia, and we will continue to support Mr. Grossi. We need to make sure that the Ukrainian agricultural sector is also protected, as this is critical for global food supply, particularly for the most vulnerable. It was also asked that exports of food supplies from Ukraine must continue uninterrupted. We will continue to work on these points.
Commitment to peace needs continuous engagement. Italy wants to do all it can, starting with the upcoming G7 ministerial meeting I will host in Fuji, close to Rome, in November, and the Mediterranean dialogues scheduled in Rome again in November. Every opportunity is important to work for a just peace. Count on the Italian government. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Tajani for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
You add military, civilian, economic, financial, and humanitarian is greater than the US. More than 100 billion euros is the bill that we have paid. Among them, 45 on military support. Less than the US? Yes, certainly, but quite an important figure. 45 billion is not negligible. And adding everything together, we are, I think, the European Union, I'm sure, the greatest supporter to Ukraine. And one thing for me is clear. As far as the Ukrainians want to resist, we have to support them. Otherwise, we will make a historical mistake. Thank you very much. Thank you.